This is a table listing the number of 4K 120Hz HDMI 2.1 ports on the top TVs we've reviewed last year. And the reason why some televisions only carry 2 HDMI 2.1 ports is because they all use a similar Mediatek HDMI 2.1 chipset that would impose such a limitation. With this in mind, many potential TV buyers have been hoping that in the year 2023, these TV manufacturers will adopt the new Mediatek Pentonic 1000 chipset, which on paper will provide 4 HDMI 2.1 ports, as you can see from the official specifications listed on Mediatek's website when the SoC was first announced. As always, I'm sorry to be the one to have to break the bad news to you. But unfortunately, even the Pentonic 1000 won't give you 4 HDMI 2.1 ports that can do 4K 120Hz in 10-bit HDR. But Vincent, how can this be? You ask. It's right there in the spec sheet. HDMI 2.1 times 4. But you see, this spec sheet was actually a cached snapshot retrieved from the Wayback Machine on the 11th of November last year when Pentonic 1000 was first announced. Since then, Mediatek has amended the webpage to just say HDMI 2.1 without specifying the number of ports. At Mediatek's booth at CES, I kept asking the company to clarify, and eventually found out that only 2 out of 4 HDMI ports on the Pentonic 1000 SoC are capable of FRL or fixed rate link signaling for transmission of 48 gigabits per second bandwidth to play HDR games at 4K 120Hz. So there's no improvement over existing Mediatek HDMI 2.1 chipsets in this regard. Since the deprecation of HDMI 2.0, there is another loophole which allows Mediatek to legally claim the provision of 4 HDMI 2.1 ports on the Pentonic 1000 SoC, even though only 2 of them can do 4K 120Hz HDR VRR. According to the HDMI licensing administrator, because HDMI 2.0 has been superseded by HDMI 2.1, a device with only HDMI 2.0 features can now be certified and marketed as HDMI 2.1, even if it doesn't carry any of the advanced features associated with HDMI 2.1, such as FRL signaling, VRR, ALLM, eARC, etc. For example, at CES, I saw a new TV advertised with only HDMI 2.1 and no HDMI 2.0 ports, but when I looked at the connection inputs behind the television, 2 of the HDMI sockets clearly topped out at 4K 60Hz, which most unsuspecting buyers won't think of as HDMI 2.1. Due to HDMI licensing administrators' lenient naming policy, we are entering into a dangerous territory where we have to clarify what HDMI 2.1 means when a manufacturer claims a product or even an HDMI port to be HDMI 2.1. Just like how Leonardo DiCaprio has to ask any girl who hits on him whether she's under 26. Coming back to the bombshell revelation that the Mediatek Pentonic 1000 chipset only has 2 HDMI 2.1 ports capable of 4K 120Hz FRL signaling, let's revisit how this affects your TV purchase decision. The first question you have to ask yourself is, do you really need 4 HDMI 2.1 ports that can do 4K 120Hz HDR VRR? Realistically, 4K 120Hz resolution and 48 gigabits per second bandwidth are only needed for playing games. And even a few years after launch, there are only a handful of HDMI 2.1 source devices on the market, such as the Sony PS5, the Xbox Series X, as well as high-end graphics cards from AMD and Nvidia. If you only watch movies from physical media or streaming, if you don't play games, or if you own a PS5 and don't intend to buy an Xbox Series X or a gaming PC while using eARC functionality, which usually occupies one of the 2 HDMI 2.1 connections, then I would argue that you don't really need 4 HDMI 2.1 ports, all capable of 4K 120Hz HDR VRR. Of course, some of you may still prefer to buy a television with 4 HDMI 2.1 ports even if you don't need them, perhaps due to fear of missing out, or for future-proofing purposes. After all, if you are already spending thousands on a telly, why not get one with 4 full-bandwidth HDMI 2.1 ports? In that case, your choice this year is still limited to high-end LG and Samsung televisions, just like in 2022. If you are eyeing an LG TV, the obvious pick will be either the C3 or the G3 OLED with 4 full-bandwidth HDMI 2.1 ports. The LG G3 should be noticeably brighter thanks to the implementation of MLA OLED panel and additional heatsink. But because it is more expensive and doesn't ship with a tabletop stand in most countries, we suspect more buyers will gravitate towards the step-down C3, which is also available in smaller screen sizes of 42 and 48 inches. And if you are considering the LG C3, there is certainly some logic to snapping out last year's C2, which also offers 4 HDMI 2.1 ports at current sale prices. If you are interested in a Samsung, this year there will be 2 OLED ranges with 4 HDMI 2.1 inputs, namely the flagship S95C with 1 connect box and the step-down S90C without 1 connect box. Many of you will be wondering if both models will be using the brighter, more durable and energy-efficient 2023 QD OLED panel from Samsung Display. And unfortunately, we haven't been able to obtain a definitive answer from Samsung Electronics. But here's what we could gather from our sources. This video is sponsored by Box, the online technology store. Visit box.co.uk for the best deals on TVs, soundbars, and all your other technology needs. All Samsung S95C sizes should be using the latest 2023 panel, being the flagship series and all. The 77-inch Samsung S90C should also be equipped with the latest 2023 panel, since this is a new screen size which should be manufactured based on new formulation. As for the 55-inch and 65-inch S90C, the target is to use the newer 2023 QD OLED panels, but owing to surplus inventory of older 2022 panels, it is likely that there will be some sort of panel lottery going on, not dissimilar to the WBC versus WBE scenario among LG C-series OLEDs over the past couple of years. Besides these 2 South Korean brands, an honorable mention has to go to TCL. Even though TCL televisions are still using Mediatek HDMI chipsets with only 2 full bandwidth HDMI 2.1 ports, the company has managed to migrate eARC functionality to one of the 2 4K 60 inputs, therefore truly freeing up the 2 full bandwidth HDMI 2.1 ports for those intending to use eARC, giving TCL TVs an advantage over rival brands using the Mediatek HDMI 2.1 chipset, Pentonic or otherwise. Of course, apart from the number of HDMI 2.1 ports, picture quality is another important factor to consider when buying a new television. To find out which TV brand is the best at different aspects of picture quality, such as color accuracy for watching movies or motion handling for watching sports, please watch our comparison video by clicking here.